Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 318 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Deathbed Visions. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
A deathbed vision is a vision that someone has just before they die. They have been reported all through history, but only recently have they been the subject of scientific study. So, what are deathbed visions? What happens during them? And what might they tell us about the afterlife? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, just one question for clarity before we begin. Recently in episode 312, we talked about terminal lucidity. Is that the same thing as a deathbed vision?
No, and people can go to mysterious.fm/312 to hear our discussion of terminal lucidity, but they're not the same thing. The only obvious thing they have in common is that they occur shortly before a person dies. Terminal lucidity is a phenomenon that occurs when a person has developed long-standing cognitive impairment, like dementia from Alzheimer's disease or a stroke or something. And then a few days or hours before they die, their full mental function suddenly comes back for a period of time. But they usually don't claim to see anything unusual while this is happening. It's just that they're able to think clearly again. They suddenly become lucid again. A deathbed vision is different in two ways. First, you don't need to have dementia to have a deathbed vision. Most of the people who have deathbed visions have never had dementia. And second, people who experience deathbed visions do see unusual things. They may see a bright light. They may hear music. They may see the spirits of dead people or angels, and they may see into the afterlife and so forth. So terminal lucidity and deathbed visions are two different phenomena. The only thing they have in common is that they happen shortly before death, although they can occur together. As we mentioned in episode 312, a person suffering from dementia may have terminal lucidity, and then while they're in that lucid state, they may also experience a deathbed vision. But they're two different things, and last time we talked about TL, whereas today we're going to be talking about DBVs.
We often begin by noting if we have a personal connection with a mystery. Jimmy, has anyone in your family ever had a deathbed vision?
I know of one case where someone did, though there may have been many more. Shortly before one of my uncles died, he had a deathbed vision. In fact, we've discussed it on the show before. It came up in episode 100, our Mysterious Celebration episode, and I interviewed his wife, my aunt, about it, and here's what we said.
The next morning, he woke up and he said, I have just been to the most terrific places. It just was wonderful. And I said, hey, sounds like you had a great dream. And he said, no, it wasn't a dream. I was really there.
So this was a qualitatively different experience than a dream.
Exactly. It was real. He's not the kind of person that has ever been interested in near-death experiences. He said, I was with angels, and he said, I had one that was my escort showing me the beautiful things on the other side. And he said, I'll tell you this, you don't ever have to be afraid of dying. It's all part of God's plan, and it is beautiful. And he said, I can tell you this. He said, angels are always with us here. He said, in fact, they're here right now. I was happy that he had that experience because then I knew that he would never fear death. And I didn't then ever have to feel
anxiety for him experiencing that.
Exactly.
Did he say anything else after the experience? I understand he referred to it a number of times, even if he didn't go into a lot of detail.
Right. He would be sitting there in his chair. He spent a lot of time sitting in his chair rather than in bed because that was better for him to be sitting up if he could. And when he was, he'd be sitting there and his eyes would be closed, but not asleep. And he'd just be sitting there. And he would all of a sudden be saying, It is so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And then, time went on and like hours, maybe the next day, he said, I wish I could remember just what it was like, because it had started to fade for him by that time. But during the time afterward, it was just so profound, so beautiful, that he loved being a part of that.
And he doesn't normally have significant memory problems. It seems like this memory may have been fading more than a normal one would for him, like maybe it was a temporary glimpse.
Right. That's my impression, Jimmy. Yeah, that's my impression.
So that's the type of deathbed vision that he reported. Episode 100 came out several years ago, and at the time, I hadn't studied survival of death phenomena the way I have now. So I was thinking about his experience in terms of a near-death experience, or NDE, which is where someone clinically dies or almost dies and then returns. But this wasn't that kind of health crisis. And today, I know that the experience would be better classified as a deathbed vision, or DBV, as they're sometimes called. And it was an experience where he got a glimpse into the other side. So it was a DBV rather than an NDE, which is why we're discussing it here.
What will we be covering in today's episode?
Well, obviously, we're going to be talking about deathbed visions, but we won't be going into everything that's known about them. We'll be covering more recent research into deathbed visions in a future episode, but today we're going to be looking at the beginning of research into them. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a book called, appropriately, Deathbed Visions by Sir William Barrett. It was one of the first books devoted to the subject, and it remains a classic in the field, though it was only at the beginning of the research that has been done. There's been a lot more since then. I want to start by looking at it because it's a classic and it's got some really fascinating material in it.
How long have people been having visions when they were on their deathbeds?
Oh, I'm sure it's been happening all through human history, including in prehistoric times. There have always been instances where dying people seem to see unusual things and learn about hidden or future information. For example, in Genesis chapter 49, it presents the dying patriarch Jacob, also known as Israel, as given a prophetic speech in which he blesses and to some extent tells the future of each of his 12 sons and the tribes that will come from them. And Moses is presented as given a similar prophetic blessing to the 12 tribes in Deuteronomy chapter 33, just before his death. In the Second Temple period, there was a Jewish and later a Christian edition of a work called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, in which each of Israel's 12 sons gives a similar prophetic speech just before their deaths about the tribes that they founded. Different editions of this work came out between about 200 BC and AD 200, so the speeches of the sons are not historical, but the book was undoubtedly influenced by Jacob's speech in Genesis 49 and Moses' speech in Deuteronomy 33. I think that works like this are likely based on the fact that dying people really do sometimes get unexpected paranormal information just before they die. In the Christian age, this was discussed even more clearly by Pope Gregory the Great, who was pope in the year 600 and who's a doctor of the church. He wrote a series of dialogues in which he discussed all kinds of interesting things, including what today are called psychic abilities, which Pope Gregory believed in. He also believed in deathbed visions. His imaginary questioner, Deacon Peter, asks Gregory why people who are at the point of death so often predict the future. And Gregory responds,
Sometimes it is through a subtle power of their own that souls can foresee the future. At other times, the future is made known to them through revelation, shortly before death. Again, they are sometimes divinely inspired when they are on the point of leaving the body, and thus enabled to gaze upon the secrets of the heavenly kingdom with the incorporeal eye of their mind.
So Pope Gregory says that dying people often predict the future because of two causes. The first cause is a subtle power of their own that allows souls to see the future. In other words, what today would be called the psychic ability of precognition, which is understood by parapsychologists as a natural human ability, albeit a subtle one. And the second cause he mentions is through revelation, or what we're calling a deathbed vision, through which the person may learn about the future or be allowed to see into the afterlife. In any event, deathbed visions have been reported all the way down through history, and significant research on them began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly with Sir William Barrett's book, Deathbed Visions. However, first, we're going to talk about an essay by Frances Power Cobbe.
Okay, who was Frances Power Cobbe?
She was an Anglo-Irish writer who was born in 1822 and who passed on to her reward in 1904 at the age of 81. She was a women's rights activist, and she was also an anti-vivisectionist, which means that she opposed the practice of doing experimental surgery on living animals as part of medical research, often without anesthesia. And these two things, women's rights and anti-vivisectionism, often went together at the time. She also wrote about religious and philosophical subjects, and in 1882, she published a book of essays called Akin and Darien. The title essay, which is the last in the book, was called Akin and Darien, The Riddle of Death. That's P-E-A-K, like a mountain peak. And in it, she proposed a line of research that would go on to inspire Sir William Barrett and his work.
The phrase peak in Darien is a literary reference that many listeners may not be familiar with. Where does it come from?
It's from a poem by the English Romantic poet John Keats, who lived in the early 1800s. He passed on to his reward in 1821 at the age of only 25. He died from what was then called consumption, but today we call it tuberculosis. Consumption, or tuberculosis, is a bacterial disease of the lungs that, among other things, makes it progressively harder to breathe. Tuberculosis used to be a huge problem, and lots of people died from it. It's even still a big problem in some parts of the world. But the subject will come up again in the texts we're going to read, so remember that what they called consumption, we now call tuberculosis. In any event, in 1816, when he was just 20, Keats published a poem called On First Lookin' into Chapman's Homer, and it's short, so here's the whole thing.
Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific and all his men, looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien.
Now, Darien is a province in the country of Panama, where today the Panama Canal links the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So the land is really thin at that point, where North and South America connect. So what Keats is envisioning is the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez and his men getting up to the top of a mountain peak in Darien province. And when they get up there, they're shocked and surprised to suddenly see the Pacific Ocean from the peak of the mountain. Frances Cobbe uses this part of the poem as a metaphor for death. In her essay, she's taken a shot at the spiritualists of her time, who were part of a movement that was using mediums to try to contact the dead. And we talked about the origin of the spiritualist movement back in episode 137 on mediums, which is at mysterious.fm/137. And we will talk about its founders, the Fox sisters, in a future episode. Now, Cobbe didn't approve of spiritualism, so she throws some shade on the use of mediums and suggests that what people should do if they want to learn about death is not go to a medium, but to carefully observe the die-in. She writes,
"We have walked in company with our brother, perchance for years, through the wilderness of this world, over its arid plains of toil, and through its sweet valleys of love and pleasure. And then we have begun to climb the awful Andes, which have always loomed before us at our journey's end, their summits against the sky, and beyond them, the undiscovered land. Onward, a little before us, as chance may decide, our companion perhaps mounts the last upward slope, and we see him slowly approach the mountain's crown, while our lagging steps yet linger on the slopes below. Sometimes, ere he reach the hilltop, he is enveloped in cloud, and then we see him no more. But again, sometimes, he remains in the full sunlight, and though distant from us, and beyond the reach of our voice, it is yet possible for us to watch his attitude and motions. Now, we see him nearing the summit. A few steps more, and there must break on his vision whatever there may be of the unknown world beyond, a howling wilderness or a great Pacific of joy. Does he seem, as that view bursts on him, whatsoever it may be, does he seem to be inspired with hope or cast down with despair? Do his arms drop in consternation, or does he lift them aloft with one glad gesture of rapture, ere he descend the further slope and is lost from our sight forever?
In other words, look to the dying person and see if, as they approach their last moments on earth, they show any signs of seeing a world beyond death, or whether they don't. Cobbe then goes on to list a number of experiences in which people appear to have had deathbed visions. For example, here's one that was related by a friend of hers.
This case was that of a boy about 14 years of age. He was a refined, highly educated child who throughout his long illness had looked forward with much hope and longing to the unknown life to which he believed he was hastening. On a bright summer morning, it became evident that he had reached his last hour. He lost the power of speech, chiefly from weakness, but he was perfectly sensible and made his wishes known to us by his intelligent looks. He was sitting propped up in bed and had been looking rather sadly at the bright sunshine playing on the trees outside his open window for some time. He had turned away from this scene, however, and was facing the end of the room, where there was nothing whatever but a closed door, when, all in a moment, the whole expression of his face changed to one of the most wondering rapture, which made his half-closed eyes open to their utmost extent, while his lips parted with a smile of perfect ecstasy. It was impossible to doubt that some glorious sight was visible to him, and, from the movement of his eyes, it was plain that it was not one, but many objects on which he gazed, for his look passed slowly from end to end of what seemed to be the vacant wall before him, going back and forward with ever-increasing delight manifested in his whole aspect. His mother then asked him if what he saw was some wonderful sight beyond the confines of this world, to give her a token that it was so, by pressing her hand. He at once took her hand, and pressed it meaningly, giving thereby an intelligent affirmative to her question, though unable to speak. As he did so, a change passed over his face, his eyes closed, and in a few minutes he was gone.
Now, in this case, we don't really know what the boy was seeing because he wasn't able to speak, but he did squeeze his mother's hand to let her know that it was a wonderful sight. However, other people can speak as their end is approaching, as in the case of this experience, which was also reported to Cobbe by the same friend.
I was watching one night beside a poor man dying of consumption. His case was hopeless, but there was no appearance of the end being very near. He was in full possession of his senses, able to talk with a strong voice, and not in the least drowsy. He had slept through the day, and was so wakeful that I had been conversing with him on ordinary subjects to while away the long hours. Suddenly, while we were thus quietly talking together, he became silent and fixed his eyes on one particular spot in the room, which was entirely vacant, even of furniture. At the same time, a look of the greatest delight changed the whole expression of his face, and, after a moment of what seemed to be intense scrutiny of some object invisible to me, he said to me in a joyous tone, "There is Jim." Jim was a little son, whom he had lost the year before, and whom I had known well. But the dying man had a son still living, named John, for whom we had sent, and I concluded it was of John he was speaking, and that he thought he heard him arriving. So I answered, "No, John has not been able to come." The man turned to me impatiently and said, "I do not mean John. I know he is not here. It is Jim, my little lame Jim. Surely you remember him." "Yes," I said. "I remember dear little Jim, who died last year, quite well." "Don't you see him then? There he is," said the man, pointing to the vacant space on which his eyes were fixed. And, when I did not answer, he repeated almost fretfully, "Don't you see him standing there?" I answered that I could not see him, though I felt perfectly convinced that something was visible to the sick man which I could not perceive. When I gave him this answer, he seemed quite amazed, and turned round to look at me with a glance almost of indignation. As his eyes met mine, I saw that a film seemed to pass over them. The light of intelligence died away. He gave a gentle sigh and expired. He did not live 5 minutes from the time he first said, "There is Jim," although there had been no sign of approaching death previous to that moment.
And as we'll see, people having DBVs often report seeing loved ones who have died appearing to them. In this case, the dying man obviously knew that his son Jim was dead, but there's an even more amazing type of experience which Cobbe's essay gave its name to. Here is her account of an experience of that type.
Another incident of a very striking character was described as having occurred in a family united very closely by affection. A dying lady, exhibiting the aspect of joyful surprise to which we have so often referred, spoke of seeing, one after another, 3 of her brothers who had long been dead, and then, apparently, recognized last of all a 4th brother, who was believed by the bystanders to still be alive in India. The coupling of his name with that of his dead brothers excited such awe and horror in the mind of one of the persons present that she rushed from the room. In due course of time, letters were received announcing the death of the brother in India, which had occurred some time before his dying sister seemed to recognize him.
So in this case, the dying woman saw 3 of her brothers who everyone knew was dead, but then she saw a 4th brother who everyone believed was alive and just fine in India. And it was such a shock to hear that he might be dead that one of the women present rushed out of the room. Then they received letters revealing that the 4th brother had died in India, even though nobody present had known that, and he had died before his sister saw him in her vision. And it is this type of experience that Cobbe's essay has given its name to. Even though Cobbe herself had used the image of standing on a mountain peak in Darien as a metaphor for getting any glimpse of the afterlife, today parapsychologists use the phrase peak in Darien specifically for experiences in which the dying person sees someone in the afterlife that they did not previously know was dead. So in today's vocabulary, if a dying person sees someone they didn't know was dead, it's a peak in Darien experience. Cobbe recounts other experiences in her essay as well, and towards the end of it, she quotes this brief one that the 19th century diarist Carolyn Fox recorded in her journals in 1856.
M.A. Schimmelpenninck is gone. She said just before her death, "Oh, I hear such beautiful voices, and the children's are the loudest."
Cobbe then writes,
"Can any old Italian picture of the ascending Madonna, with a cloud of cherub heads forming a glory of welcome around her as she enters the higher world, be more significant than this actual fact, so simply told, of a saintly woman in dying hearing beautiful voices, and the children's the loudest?" Of course, like all the rest, it may have been only a physiological phenomenon, a purely subjective impression. But it is at least remarkable that a second sense should thus be under the same enchantment, and that again we have to confront, in the case of hearing as of sight, the anomaly of the real or supposed presence of the beautiful and the delightful, instead of the terrible and the frightful, while nature is in the pangs of disillusion. Does the brain, then, unlike every known instrument, give forth its sweetest music as its chords are breaking? Instances like those recorded in this paper might, I believe, be almost indefinitely multiplied, were attention directed to them, and the experience of survivors more generally communicated and recorded. Reviewing them, the question seems to press upon us: why should we not thus catch a glimpse of the spiritual world through that half-open portal wherein our dying brother is passing?
Cobbe thus envisioned someone taking up that task of directing attention to these experiences and recording them. And that's what Sir William Barrett did in his book, Deathbed Visions.
Then let's talk about its author, who was Sir William Barrett.
William Fletcher Barrett was a British physicist and psychical researcher. He was born in 1844, and he passed on to his reward in 1925 at the age of 81. According to the Science Encyclopedia,
William Fletcher Barrett was born on February 10, 1844, in Kingston, Jamaica, where his British father, Congregationalist minister William Garland Barrett, carried out missionary work. The family returned to England in 1848, settling in Royston, Hertfordshire, then moved in 1855 to Manchester, where William attended the Old Trafford Grammar School. His parents were unable to pay for his formal further education, but he managed to attend lectures on chemistry and physics, following which he was invited by physicist John Tyndall to become an assistant in his laboratory, where he mastered the skills needed for experimentation. Barrett left Tyndall's employ in 1866 to take the position of science teacher at the London International College, then physics lecturer at the Royal Naval School of Architecture, which allowed him more time to pursue private scientific studies. In 1873, Barrett was appointed to a chair in experimental physics at the Royal College of Science for Ireland in Dublin, where, in addition to teaching regular students, he gave evening classes for underprivileged youths. Among other achievements, he developed stelloy, an alloy made from silicon and iron that became extensively used in early telecommunications technology. Barrett was elected to the Royal Society in 1899. He retired in 1910 and was knighted for his contribution to physics in 1912. He married Florence Elizabeth Perry, an obstetrical and gynecological surgeon and co-founder of the London School of Medicine for Women in 1916. Barrett died in London on May 26, 1925.
In 1874, Barrett began to take an interest in parapsychology, or psychical research as it was then called. In 1882, he helped form the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, in England. Barrett also helped inspire the founding of the American Society for Psychical Research, or ASPR, in 1885, along with American psychiatrist and philosopher William James. Unfortunately, the ASPR is basically defunct today, although it still legally exists. But the British SPR is still active, and I happen to be a member of it. Toward the end of his life, Barrett began collecting reports of DBVs, and he started work on his book, Deathbed Visions. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1925 when the book was still unfinished. But his widow, Lady Florence Barrett, did a very light edit of the unfinished manuscript, and it was published the following year in 1926, only to go on to become a classic in the field despite the fact it was unfinished.
So let's talk about the book itself. What should we know about it?
Well, the book has 6 chapters, most of which are devoted to different kinds of deathbed visions. They are mostly composed of case reports. That is, just they list one case after another. So the book is primarily a database of instances where DBVs happened. There is a bit of speculative analysis of the cases. This is primarily in Chapter 1, and there's also a bit in Lady Barrett's preface, but the book is really more of a database. Sir Barrett might have added more analysis if he'd lived to complete the work, but he died unexpectedly while composing it, and it looks like he didn't really get past the data collection stage and into the data analysis stage. Also, something else to be aware of is a privacy convention that they were using back when the book was written. Back then, if a person didn't want their name publicly known, they would often refer to them by their initials. So you'll be hearing about people like Mrs. B, Dr. L, and Miss R. Or when they really want to protect the privacy, you'll hear about Dr. Z or Mrs. X. But in all these cases, you're hearing letters of the alphabet being used as initials, B, L, R, Z, X, and so forth. Sometimes you'll even hear double initials like GW, which might stand, for example, for George Washington if he wanted to keep his privacy. Other times, you'll hear people's full names if they didn't mind their names being publicly known. Personally, I find the use of initials a little annoying. I'd prefer it if they just gave people false names and told us they were pseudonyms. That's what I did in episode 268 on Mysterious Voices, where we were talking about the case of an individual woman who was referred to in the British Medical Journal by the initials AB. So I called her Annabelle to keep us from having to say AB over and over again. But today's cases are devoted to different people known by different initials, so I'm just going to leave the initials as they are. I just want to let listeners know, particularly of the audio version of the podcast, what's going on, and those are letters of the alphabet you're hearing.
Then let's look at some of the cases. What type of deathbed vision that Sir Barrett considers do you want to start with?
I guess I want to start with some of the most typical ordinary experiences, and then we'll move on to look at some of the more interesting variations that occur. The core of a typical experience is that a person who is dying sees something that makes them happy. As in cases we heard from Frances Cobbe's essay, they may include seeing a beautiful light, hearing beautiful music, or seeing figures such as of angels or departed loved ones. One experience I was particularly interested to read about was that of Dwight L. Moody, or D.L. Moody, as he was sometimes called. D.L. Moody was a famous American evangelist in the 19th century. He founded Moody Bible Institute and Moody Publishers, and I've both read some of his books and multiple books by Moody Publishers. So I was quite interested to read this experience, which Sir Barrett took from his biography, as Moody was dying at the age of 62 in 1899.
Suddenly he murmured, "Earth recedes, heaven opens up before me. I have been beyond the gates. God is calling. Don't call me back. It is beautiful. It is like a trance. If this is death, it is sweet." Then his face lit up, and he said in a voice of joyful rapture, "Dwight, Irene, I see the children's faces," referring to his two little grandchildren who had gone before. Turning to his wife, he said, "Mama, you have been a good wife to me." And with that, he became unconscious.
So this is a fairly typical deathbed vision. D.L. Moody saw heaven open in front of him, so he saw into the afterlife, and he saw the spirits of two of his deceased grandchildren, Dwight and Irene. Another similar case is this one, which was contributed by a Dr. Paul Edwards.
While living in a country town in California about the year 1887, I was called upon to visit a very dear lady friend who was very low and weak from consumption. Everyone knew that this pure and noble wife and mother was doomed to die, and at last she herself became convinced that immediate death was inevitable, and accordingly she prepared for the event. Calling her children to her bedside, she kissed each in turn, sending them away as soon as goodbye was said. Then came the husband's turn to step up and bid farewell to a most loving wife who was perfectly clear in her mind. She began by saying, "Newton," for that was his Christian name, "do not weep over me, for I am without pain and am wholly serene. I love you upon earth and shall love you after I have gone. I am fully resolved to come to you if such a thing is possible, and if it is not possible, I will watch you and the children from heaven, where I will be waiting when you all come. My first desire now is to go. I see people moving all in white. The music is strangely enchanting. Oh, here is Sadie. She is with me, and she knows who I am." Sadie was a little girl she had lost about 10 years before. "Sissy," said the husband, "you are out of your mind." "Oh, dear, why did you call me here again?" said the wife. "Now it will be hard for me to go away again. I was so pleased while there. It was so delightful, so soothing." In about 3 minutes, the dying woman added, "I am going away again, and will not come back to you, even if you call me. This scene lasted for about 8 minutes, and it was very plain that the dying wife was in full view of the two worlds at the same time, for she described how the moving figures looked in the world beyond, as she directed her words to mortals in this world.
Sometimes this perception of the next life and the current life at the same time is referred to as double consciousness, that is, being conscious of both worlds, so you may hear others referring to it this way. In this case, the woman saw people moving in white, she heard beautiful music, and she recognized a daughter that she had lost a decade earlier. As the vision was progressing, she was apparently transferring more and more of her awareness into the afterlife when her husband spoke to her, and it jerked her awareness back into this life. But she said a few minutes later that she would go away again and not come back. Incidentally, her husband was skeptical of what she was seeing and apparently thought she was delirious, which does sometimes happen when people are dying. But the reporting doctor explicitly noted that the woman was, in his words, perfectly clear in her mind. I'd also note that when dying people are hallucinating, they tend to hallucinate random stuff like the content of dreams, and they often hallucinate frightening, disturbing stuff like monsters or being menaced. And deathbed visions are not like that. They tend to be pleasant, and they tend to focus on the same themes: light, music, beauty, angels, and departed loved ones. DBVs might be different for those who go on to have distressing near-death experiences, which we talked about in episode 292, so you can go to mysterious.fm/292 for that. But I haven't yet run across a resource documenting negative deathbed visions, though there may be some. Sometimes the dying person perceives a kind of barrier between this life and the next, such as in this case that was reported by a Dr. Wilson from New York. He reports that he was attending the death of a well-known American tenor named James Moore.
Then something which I shall never forget to my dying day happened, something which is utterly indescribable. While he appeared perfectly rational and as sane as any man I have ever seen, the only way that I can express it is that he was transported into another world, and although I cannot satisfactorily explain the matter to myself, I am fully convinced that he had entered the Golden City, for he said in a stronger voice than he had used since I had attended him, "There is Mother." "Why, Mother, have you come here to see me?" No, I'm coming to see you. Just wait, Mother. I'm almost over. I can jump it."
So Mr. Moore apparently saw some kind of barrier between this life and the next, and he told his mother he could jump over this barrier to reach her in the afterlife. Another visualization of the barrier comes from this account, which was contributed by Mrs. Shepherd Munn, the widow of a church vicar.
A young boy, aged 14, named Charles Dyer, who lived with his parents at Orleton, was dying of consumption and had wasted away very rapidly in 4 or 5 months. During the whole of that period, he was very bright, full of interest in all around, and did not seem to be aware of his rapidly failing strength. About a week before he died, he slept in a room off his mother's. With no door between, he called her, and when she went in, he was full of excitement about a door he could see at the corner of his room, which he said was opening wider and wider. "And when it is open wide, I shall be going through it, Mother." On the morning of the day he died, his mother, having left the room to fetch him something, heard him call, and, hastening back, found him sitting up in bed, looking towards the corner of the room. And he said to her, "There is a nice old man come for me. He is holding out his arms for me. I must go. Don't fret, Mother." And he fell back gently on his pillow, and was gone, without any struggle for breath, and with a smile of joy on his face, which remained.
In this case, young Dyer perceived the barrier as a door that was opening between this life and the next. It apparently opened over the course of a week, and then a nice old man came to take him to the next life. In other episodes, we've talked about how departed spirits, ghosts, can appear any way they choose to appear, such as younger or older than they were at the time of death. And that's reflected in another experience that was reported by Mrs. Munn, It also happened in the same family.
An old man named John George, grandfather of the consumptive boy Charles Dyer, already referred to, lay dying. He and his wife, Mary Ann George, had had a great sorrow that same year in the death of their youngest son, Tom, a young man who had been killed on the railway line on which he worked. The dying man had been quiet for some time, as though sleeping, when he suddenly looked up, opened his eyes wide, and looking at the side of the bed opposite to where his wife was, exclaimed, "Why, Mother, here is Tom, and he is all right. No marks on him. Oh, he looks fine." Then, after another silence, he said, "And here's Nance, too." A pause, then, "Mother, she is all right. She has been forgiven." And very soon after, he passed away, taking with him a sorrow which had long pressed upon the mother's heart. For Nance had fallen into sin, and had died soon after the child was born, and, as the poor mother thought, never having had time to repent.
So in this case, Mr. George's son Tom was not showing any physical injuries from the train accident he died in, and they used to have lots of train accidents back in the day. Mr. George also learned that his daughter, Nance, had been forgiven after having a child out of wedlock, which is a very serious thing because children need to grow up with both parents. Nance had apparently died shortly after childbirth, probably as the result of childbirth, which also used to happen all the time. Now, one of the things that's interesting about deathbed visions, or DBVs, are their similarities with NDEs, or near-death experiences. Many of the same elements that appear in NDEs, like joy, light, and the spirits of angels or departed loved ones, appear in both. It's kind of like DBVs are sort of NDEs that happen before physical death occurs. Another element that is reported in NDEs, even though a person's death was painful and the resuscitation efforts of the doctors were using could also be painful, at some point the pain just seems to shut off. And that's also reported with DBVs. For example, here's a case reported by a nurse named Joyce Snell.
It was that of an old soldier, Mr. Octorloni, aged 59, who was in the last stages of tuberculosis, brought on by exposure while fighting his country's battles. He was brave and patient, but had frequent paroxysms of pain that were almost unendurable, and he longed for the relief which he knew death alone could bring him. One of these spasms had seized upon him, and his features were convulsed with agony as he fought for breath, when he suddenly grew calm. A smile lit up his face, and looking upwards, he exclaimed, with a ring of joy in his voice, "Marian, my daughter." Then the end came. His brother and sister were at the bedside. The sister said to the brother, "He saw Marian, his favorite daughter. She came and took him where he will suffer no more." And she added fervently, "Thank God, he has found rest at last."
In this case, the gentleman was in the middle of a violent seizure of pain as he was trying to breathe when suddenly the pain shut off when his DBV was happening and he passed peacefully. A similar experience was also reported by Mrs. Munn.
A woman named Mary Wilding was dying of cancer. She was passionately fond of her husband, Charles Wilding. They had worked together, brought up their children, saved some money, and bought a nice little house in Orleton, where they spent some comfortable and happy years together. When she realized that she would die and leave Charlie, she became very unhappy and made all of them very miserable by fretting and constantly complaining of her fate. One day, as the end drew near, when a sister of hers, who was helping to look after her, happened to be alone in the room with Mary Wilding, she suddenly looked up with such a bright expression of face and said, "Oh, Emmy, Mother is here. She has come for me and is going to take me with her." She never lost the feeling of confidential joy and passed away the day after, quite peacefully.
In this case, the distress that Mrs. Wilding had was clearly emotional, all the complaints she made about having to die, but her mood was also likely influenced by physical pain from the cancer. Then, when she had her DBV of her mother, all the complaining stopped, and she passed peacefully a few days later. One thing that NDE researchers have noted is that it isn't just people who believe in an afterlife who have near-death experiences. They happen to people who, no matter what their beliefs are. And the same thing is true of DBVs, as illustrated by this case reported by Mr. Rudd Gitterman.
My father died in Germany on March 18th, 1892, and my mother then came to live with us at Odessa. Shortly after, she fell ill and died on May 6th of the following year, 1893. Both she and my father had always been most skeptical of anything concerning the existence and survival of the soul. A few minutes before her death, she regained consciousness, having been in a state of coma for 2 hours previously, raised herself in her bed, stretched out her arms, and with a happy smile on her face cried out, "Papa! Papa!" just as if she suddenly saw him in front of her. Immediately after, she fell back into the arms of my wife and expired. My mother used to call her husband Papa, just as we children did.
So despite not believing in an afterlife, Mrs. Gitterman nevertheless experienced a DBV of her husband who had died the year before. Another thing that is true of NDEs is that they are reported all over the world and from people in every culture. And as NDE research has matured, more work has been done on NDEs in different parts of the world. In the next episode that we devote to deathbed visions, I plan to talk about a classic study that was published in 1977. It looked at DBVs in America and compared them to those taking place in India, a different culture. But Sir Barrett was writing at the dawn of DBV research, and so his book focuses almost entirely on DBVs that were had by Europeans and those of European descent. But even then, it was known that they occur in other cultures. For example, here's a case reported by an assistant hospital matron in Saskatchewan, Canada. She worked at the Atakakoops Indian Hospital, and I have to say that Atakakoop is a super cool name because it means star blanket. In any event, she reports,
He was a Cree Indian lad, about 20 years of age, son of Chief Papawin of a neighboring reserve. He was in the last stage of pulmonary tuberculosis and had been brought here to be cared for till the finish. He was placed in a wigwam about 100 yards distant. At last, the supreme day arrived. It was evening, and I was with him. He was lying quietly in his bed, when suddenly he sat up, stretched forth his arms with a yearning gesture, while an ecstatic smile broke over his face. It was not simply a smile of pleasure, but something far beyond it. The veil was lifted, and no one who was looking on could fail to realize that it was a glorious vision that met his gaze. He then lay back in his bed, looked at me with a smile, and passed away. He had been calm and collected during the day. There was no delirium. It was an unclouded glimpse of that higher life into which he was just entering.
Now, thus far, we've been looking at fairly standard deathbed visions, ones that are simply subjective experiences had by the person who's dying without any independent confirming factors. The people having the DBVs report that they're dying, but they knew that anyway, so that's not really confirming evidence that the experience is objectively real. The only indicator of that which we have seen thus far is the fact that these are different than normal hallucinations. They don't contain random elements, and they don't tend to be disturbing, which hallucinations induced by physical causes often are. So we're going to be moving on to look at DBVs that do have extra confirming evidence. One way that can happen is if the DBV contains veridical paranormal information. That is, if it contains information that the relevant parties did not have any normal way of knowing, but that later turns out to be true. Like if someone is able to predict the future concerning they shouldn't concerning something they shouldn't be able to know or be able to guess. And then the prediction comes true. Earlier in this episode, we quoted from Pope St. Gregory the Great, noting that some people had DBVs in which they got information about the future. And there are precognitive elements to the DBVs that are reported today, such as in this case, which was reported by a Presbyterian woman named Mrs. H.
Had I ever doubted that there was a life beyond, my doubt would have been removed by what I call a vision. In 1883, I was the mother of 2 strong, healthy boys. The eldest was a bright boy named Ray, of 2 years and 7 months. The other, a darling baby boy of 8 months. August 6, 1883, my baby died. Ray, my surviving little son, was then in perfect health. Every day after baby's death, and I may safely say every hour in the day, he would say to me, "Mama, baby calls Ray." He would often leave his play and come running to me, saying, "Mama, baby calls Ray all the time." Every night he would awaken me out of my sleep and say, "Mama, baby calls Ray all the time. He wants Ray to come where he is. You must not cry when Ray goes, Mama. You must not cry, for baby wants Ray." One day I was sweeping the sitting room floor, and he came running as fast as he could run through the dining room, where stood the table with baby's high chair, which Ray now used at the side. I never saw him so excited, and he grabbed my dress and pulled me to the dining room door, jerked it open, saying, "Oh, Mama, Mama, come quick. Baby is sitting in his high chair." As soon as he opened the door and looked at the chair, he said, "Oh, Mama, why didn't you hurry? Now he's gone." He laughed at Ray when he passed the chair. Oh, he laughed at Ray so nice. "Ray is going with baby, but you must not cry, Mama." Ray soon became very sick. Nursing and medicine were of no avail. He died October 13th, 1883, 2 months and 7 days after baby's death. He was a child of high intelligence and matured far beyond his years. Whether it is possible for the dead to return, and whether my baby came back and was seen by his little brother or not, we leave for others to judge.
So in this case, it appears that little Ray H., who was just 2 years and 9 months old at the time of his death, may have been having DBVs of his deceased baby brother, who let him know that he would be dying soon too. Either that, or you could say that little Ray was having after-death communications, or ADCs, from his baby brother. And we talked about after-death communications in episodes 306 and again in 307. So you can go to mysterious.fm/306 and mysterious.fm/307 for those. Either way, little Ray was getting information about the future from these experiences shortly before he died. And this could be seen as paranormal because, according to his mother, little Ray was in perfect health. Yet he started announcing his forthcoming death despite his health, and he didn't fall ill until very shortly before he died. Here's another case where something similar happens. In this one, a girl falls sick, but then she recovers. Then she has a DBV of Jesus, and that night she falls ill again and passes on 4 days later. This experience report is longer than the other ones we've been looking at, but it's extremely interesting. It was reported by Miss H.A. Dallas, and it takes place in Yuba County, California, which you may remember from episode 85 on The Boys from Yuba City. That was a 20th century mystery, but this experience took place in the 19th.
Daisy Irene Dryden was born in Marysville, Yuba County, California, on September 9, 1854. She died in San Jose, California, on October 8, 1864, aged 10 years and 29 days. Her mother writes, "In the summer of 1864, Daisy was attacked by bilious fever. After 5 weeks of illness, the fever left her, and for 2 weeks, she seemed to continue to gain strength.
Bilious fever is an old medical diagnosis that refers to fever associated with excess bile or bilirubin in the blood. Bilirubin is a reddish-orange compound that our bodies make when they break down old or damaged red blood cells. And if you have too much in your blood, you get jaundice, which means that you turn yellow or more yellow than you normally are. So bilious fever was how they used to refer to fever accompanied by jaundice. Fortunately, Daisy seemed to have recovered from this condition, or almost recovered.
She smiled and sang and seemed like herself again, until one afternoon, as her father sat by her bed, he noticed a singular expression on her face. It was one of both pleasure and amazement. Her eyes were directed to one place above the door. Her father asked, "Daisy, what is it? What do you see?" She replied softly, "It is a spirit. It is Jesus. And he says I am going to be one of his little lambs." "Yes, dear," said her father. "I hope you are one of his lambs." "Oh, Papa," she exclaimed, "I'm going to heaven, to him." That night, she was taken with enteritis and only lived 4 days. She suffered much for the first 24 hours, being unable to retain food, water, or medicine. From that time on, she had very little pain. Her poor little body had in fact become so attenuated that there was little left for the disease to work upon. But her mind was very active and remarkably clear. Her faculties appeared sharpened. She could remember recitations she had learned in school, always having been fond of memorizing poetry. And when her sister Lulu sang to her from the Sunday school hymnal, she would give the name of the song and the page on which to find it. She loved to have us read the scriptures to her. I read in John 14, "It is expedient for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Comforter will not come unto you. But if I depart, I will send him unto you." At this, she looked up to me so heavenly as she said, "Mama, when I go away, the Comforter will come to you. And maybe he will let me come too sometimes. I'll ask Allie about it." She often said this after this time, when she felt uncertain about anything. Allie was her brother, who had passed to the other life at the age of 6 of scarlet fever 7 months before. He seemed to be with her a great deal of the time during those last 3 days, because when we asked her questions which she could not answer, she would say, "Wait till Allie comes, and I will ask him." On this occasion, she waited only a short time and then said, "Allie says I may go to you sometimes. He says it is possible. But you will not know when I am there. But I can speak to your thought."
So this is interesting. Daisy is apparently confirming with her brother Allie that after-death communications are possible, though it's ambiguous whether the mother would be aware of her visits. She said that you will not know when I am there, but that may mean her mother wouldn't see her physical form, because she says she will be able to speak to your thought, suggesting telepathic communication.
As I have said, Daisy lingered on the borderland for 3 days, after the first agonizing 24 hours had passed. Her physical frame had become so emaciated that there was only enough to hold the spirit in its feeble embrace, and it was manifested to us, as it were, through the thin veil of the attenuated flesh which enwrapped it. During this time, she dwelt in both worlds, as she expressed it. 2 days before she left us, the Sunday school superintendent came to her. She talked very freely about going, and sent a message to him to the Sunday school. When he was about to leave, he said, "Well, Daisy, you will soon be over the dark river." After he had gone, she asked her father what he had meant by the dark river. He tried to explain it, but she said, "It is all a mistake. There is no river. There is no curtain. There is not even a line that separates this life from the other life." And she stretched out her little hands from the bed, and with a gesture said, "It is here, and it is there. I know it is so, for I can see you all, and I see them there at the same time."
So unlike some of the other experience, Daisy was not perceiving a barrier between this life and the next. She was seeing them as integrated together.
We asked her to tell us something of that other world and how it looked to her, but she said, "I cannot describe it. It is so different. I could not make you understand." One morning, while I was in the room, putting it in order, Mrs. W., one of our kind neighbors, was reading to her these words from the Testament. "Let not your heart be troubled. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. John 14, verses 1 through 2. Daisy remarked, mansions. That means houses. I don't see real houses there, but there is what would be places to meet each other in. Allie speaks of going to such and such a place, but says nothing of houses. You see, perhaps the Testament tells about mansions, so we will feel we are going to have a home in heaven. And perhaps when I get there, I'll find a home. And if I do, the heavenly flowers and trees that I love so much here, for I do see them, and that they are more beautiful than anything you could imagine, they will be there.
Here, there is likely a translation issue with the King James Bible that I assume they were using. The Greek term that the King James renders mansions is monai. And monai doesn't just mean what we would think of as a mansion. It means just a dwelling place. So Jesus was assuring us that there are many places for people in God's kingdom, not that there will be houses or mansions specifically, though some have reported seeing them in NDEs and ADCs.
I said, Daisy, don't you know the Bible speaks of heaven being a beautiful city? She said, I do not see a city. And a puzzled look came over her face, and she said, I do not know. I may have to go there first.
Beautiful cities are also sometimes reported in NDEs and ADCs, but Daisy apparently didn't see one from the glimpse that she had, though she thought that she might see them once she got there and got a better look.
Mrs. W., a kind neighbor, the one who had read of the mansions to Daisy, and who was with us a great deal, told Mrs. B., a neighbor of hers, about Daisy's inner sight being open. Mrs. B. was a lady who did not believe in a future state. She was, moreover, in deep distress, having just lost her husband and a son who was about 12 years old, named Bateman. She came with Mrs. W. one evening, and, sitting beside the bed, began to ask questions. Daisy said to her, Bateman is here, and he says he is alive and well, and is in such a good place he would not come home for anything. He says he is learning how to be good.
So that would suggest that Bateman was experiencing a form of what Catholics refer to as purgatory. Learning how to be good is how a 10-year-old might understand being purified of the disordered desires that incline us to sin.
Mrs. B. then said, Ask him if he has seen his father. Daisy replied, He says he has not. He is not here, and says to you, Mother, don't fret about me. It is better I did not grow up. This communication set the mother to thinking, and she became a firm believer in a future state. The following morning, when alone with Daisy, Mrs. W., who had brought Mrs. B. to see her, asked Daisy how she could think Mrs. B.'s son was happy. For, said Mrs. W., when he was here, you know he was such a bad boy. Don't you remember how he used to swear, and steal your things, and break them up? You know we did not allow him to play with you, nor with my children, because he was so bad. Daisy replied, Oh, Auntie, don't you know he never went to Sunday school, and was always hearing so much swearing? God knows he did not have half a chance.
So this reflects the Christian understanding that God takes your background into account. It isn't just a question of whether what you did was wrong. It's also a question of how responsible you were for doing it, given the background you had and what you were dealing with.
The same day, her Sunday school teacher, Mrs. H., who also was with her a great deal, was sitting beside her, when Daisy said to her, Your 2 children are here. Now, these children had gone to the other life several years before, and if they had lived in this world, would have been nearly grown up. Daisy had never heard anyone speak of them, nor did the mother have any pictures of them. So she could not have known anything whatever about them before seeing them in the spiritual world. When asked to describe them, her description of them as full-grown did not agree with the mother's idea of them, so she said, How can that be? They were children when they died. Daisy answered, Allie says, children do not stay children. They grow up as they do in this life. Mrs. H. then said, But my little daughter Mary fell, and was so injured that she could not stand straight. To this, Daisy replied, "She is all right now. She is straight and beautiful, and your son is looking so noble and happy."
So this is another piece of vertical information that would support the reality of this deathbed vision. If it is correct that Daisy had no way of knowing about these children, but learned that Mrs. H had previously had a son and a daughter, both of whom had died. Mrs. H was surprised by Daisy's description of them as being older, but Daisy reported her brother Allie saying that children don't stay children in the afterlife, but grow up. I would be very skeptical of the idea that they grow up at the same rate they do in this life, because aging is a biological process driven by the body, which they don't have in the afterlife. However, Allie may not have meant that they grow up at the same rate, and we've already discussed in various episodes how departed spirits seem to be able to appear any way they wish to. And so Mrs. H's children may have been showing what they would look like now if they had grown up.
Once she said, "Oh, Papa, do you hear that? It is the singing of the angels. Well, you ought to hear it, for the room is full of it. And I can see them, there are so many. I can see them miles and miles away." Mrs. W., already mentioned, who had lost her father a short time previous, wanted to know if Daisy had seen him, and brought his picture, to let her see if she could recognize him. But in the evening, when she came again, Daisy told her she had not seen him, and that Allie, whom she had asked about him, had not seen him, but that Allie had said he would ask someone who could tell him about him. In a moment, Daisy said, "Allie is here, and says, 'Tell Auntie her father wants her to meet him in heaven, for he is there.'" Mrs. W. then said, "Daisy, why did not Allie know at once about my father?" "Because," she replied, "those who die go into different states or places, and do not see each other at all times, but all the good are in the state of the blessed."
So nice to get confirmation that Mr. W. was in heaven, even if Daisy and Allie hadn't seen him.
During those last days of illness, Daisy loved to listen to her sister Lulu as she sang for her, mostly from the Sunday school songbook. Lulu sang one song, the chorus of which was, "Oh, come, angel band, come and around me stand. Oh, bear me away on your snowy wings to my immortal home."
I always like to let listeners hear what things sounded like in the accounts we relate, so I looked up this song, and here's what the chorus sounded like. So that's what Lulu was singing for Daisy.
When she had finished, Daisy exclaimed, "Oh, Lulu, is it not strange? We always thought the angels had wings, but it is a mistake. They don't have any." Lulu replied, "But they must have wings, else how do they fly down from heaven?" "Oh, but they don't fly," she answered. "They just come. When I think of Allie, he is here."
And this agrees with the way angels are presented in the Bible. In Christian art, we often see angels depicted as humans with wings, but that's not the way the Bible does it. Apart from special types of angels like the seraphim and the cherubim that have animal parts, human-looking angels are just presented as humans, sometimes wearing white garments, but not with wings. And since heaven is not literally up in the physical sky, they don't have physical bodies anyway. They don't need wings to resist the Earth's gravity. Notice that here Daisy is reporting something different from what her religious education had suggested. And that suggests that her vision is not just a product of her upbringing, because if it was all based on imagination of her upbringing, she would have reported angels with wings, just like her upbringing had suggested.
Once I inquired, "How do you see the angels?" She replied, "I do not see them all the time, but when I do, the walls seem to go away, and I can see ever so far. And you can't begin to count the people. Some are near, and I know them. Others I have never seen before." She mentioned the name of Mary C., the sister of Mrs. S., who was a neighbor of ours in Nevada City, and said, "You know she had such a bad cough, but she is well now, and so beautiful, and she is smiling to me."
Unfortunately, they don't clarify whether Daisy had any way of knowing that Mary C. had died. If she did not have a way of knowing that, but learned it from her vision, then this would be one of the Akin and Darien experiences that we'll be discussing further.
I was then sitting beside her bedside, her hand clasped in mine. Looking up so wistfully to me, she said, "Dear Mama, I do wish you could see Allie. He is standing beside you." Involuntarily, I looked around, but Daisy thereupon continued, "He says you cannot see him because your spirit eyes are closed, but that I can, because my body only holds my spirit, as it were, by a thread of life." I then inquired, "Does he say that now?" "Yes, just now," she answered. Then, wondering how she could be conversing with her brother, when I saw not the least sign of conversation, I said, "Daisy, how do you speak to Allie? I do not hear you or see your lips move." She smilingly replied, "We just talk with our think."
In other words, they communicate telepathically, and "we talk with our think" is a pretty good way for a 10-year-old in California in 1864 to explain it. The term telepathy wasn't even coined until 1882, nearly 20 years later. Also, she referred to her enhanced perception abilities as coming about because of her body's connection with the soul breaking down. So her spirit's faculties were starting to come online or be disencumbered by the body. That's something that is reported in cases of this type in general, and it's something that may be part of what's happening in terminal lucidity, as we discussed.
I then asked her further, "Daisy, how does Allie appear to you? Does he seem to wear clothes?" She answered, "Oh, no, not clothes such as we wear. There seems to be about him a white, beautiful something, so fine and thin and glistening, and oh so white. And yet there is not a fold, or a sign of thread in it, so it cannot be cloth, but it makes him look so lovely." Her father then quoted from the psalmist, "He is clothed with light as a garment." Psalm 104, 2. "Oh, yes, that's it," she replied.
In Psalm 104, it's actually God that's described as clothing himself with light, but there's no reason that a departed soul couldn't appear that way too.
She often spoke of dying, and seemed to have such a vivid sense of her future life and happiness that the dread of death was all dispelled. The mystery of the soul's departure was to her no more a mystery. It was only a continuation of life, a growing up from the conditions of earth life into the air and sunshine of heaven. The morning of the day she died, she asked me to let her have a small mirror. I hesitated, thinking the sight of her emaciated face would be a shock to her. But her father, sitting by her, remarked, "Let her look at her poor little face if she wants to." So I gave it to her. Taking the glass in her two hands, she looked at her image for a time, calmly and sadly. At length she said, "This body of mine is about worn out. It is like that old dress of Mama's hanging there in the closet. She doesn't wear it anymore, and I don't wear my body anymore, because I have a new spiritual body which will take its place. Indeed, I have it now. For it is with my spiritual eyes I see the heavenly world, while my body is still here. You will lay my body in the grave, because I will not need it again. It was made for my life here, and now my life here is at an end, and this poor body will be laid away, and I shall have a beautiful body, like Allie's.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to our future resurrection bodies as spiritual bodies, but here Daisy is using the term in a different sense, apparently for something we have between death and resurrection. I'm not sure how much emphasis to put on that, because Daisy may have inferred that she had a spiritual body from the fact that she could perceive the next world, which she understood in terms of having her spiritual eyes open that she was seeing the next world with. But that may have just been a child's way of understanding a perceptual ability that is extrasensory, meaning it occurs without a sense organ. However, while the church does not teach that we have something that could be described as an immaterial body while we're between death and resurrection, it doesn't teach that we don't either, so that would be a matter of speculation.
Then she said to me, "Mama, open the shutters, and let me look out at the world for the last time. Before another morning, I shall be gone." As I obeyed her loving request, she said to her father, "Raise me up, Papa." Then, supported by her father, she looked through the window whose shutters I had opened and called out, "Goodbye, sky. Goodbye, trees. Goodbye, flowers. Goodbye, white rose. Goodbye, red rose. Goodbye, beautiful world," and added, "How I love it. But I do not wish to stay." That evening, when it was 8:30, she herself observed the time and remarked, "It is 8:30 now. When it is 11:30, Allie will come for me." She was then, for the time being, reclining on her father's breast, with her head upon his shoulder. This was a favorite position, as it rested her. She said, "Papa, I want to die here. When the time comes, I will tell you." Lulu had been singing for her, and as 8:30 was Lulu's bedtime, she arose to go. Bending over Daisy, as she always did, she kissed her and said, "Good night." Daisy put up her hand and, stroking tenderly her sister's face, said to her, "Good night." When Lulu was halfway up the stairs, Daisy again called out after her, in a clear, sweet, earnest tone, "Good night, and goodbye, my sweet darling Lulu." At about 11:15, she said, "Now, Papa, take me up. Allie has come for me." After her father had taken her, she asked us to sing. Presently, someone said, "Call Lulu." But Daisy answered promptly, "Don't disturb her. She is asleep." And then, just as the hands of the clock pointed to the 11:30, the time she had predicted that Allie was to come take her with him, she lifted up both arms and said, "Come, Allie," and breathed no more. Then, tenderly laying her loved but lifeless form upon the pillow, her father said, "The dear child is gone," and added, "She will suffer no more."
Now, before we move on from here, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Frederick H., Megan S., Rhonda M., Josh W., and Thomas P. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, where do you want to go from here?
Since we're dealing with the beginning of research into deathbed visions, this is more of an exploratory episode. We're primarily concerned with describing what the experiences are like, and we'll do a more detailed analysis of them in the future after looking at more mature research. So what I'd like to do now is just make some remarks on DBVs from the faith and reason perspectives and illustrate them with a few more cases. From the faith perspective, none of the material that comes through in this collection of DBVs contradicts the Christian faith. And we've already seen how the Christian tradition has been open to deathbed visions occurring, such as with Pope St. Gregory the Great, and how prophetic deathbed experiences like this may have influenced the Bible and related literature. This is not to say that everything reported in a DBV is guaranteed to be accurate. Some DBVs may be hoaxes by those who claimed to witness a dying person having one, or the report may be based on the faulty memories of the people who witnessed a DBV. And then there's the question of the beliefs and perceptions of the person having the experience. Everything living humans perceive about the afterlife is partial and likely symbolic of a greater reality that we can't currently understand. And people aren't seeing very far into the afterlife in a DBV. In fact, they're not even dead yet. So they're not guaranteed some kind of heavenly 100% accuracy. And what they perceive is likely affected by their previous beliefs. They're having an experience, and they will naturally tend to interpret that experience in terms of what they already believe, just like we do with experiences every day. So we shouldn't take what is reported in DBVs or what is said by DBV experiencers as if it's gospel truth, but we should be open to what is reported and think critically about it from the perspective of faith.
What about the reason perspective? You've said that some deathbed visions have more evidence of being real than others, like ones that contain veridical information that the relevant people didn't know.
Yeah, such as ones that contain information about the future that no living person knew. We saw an example of this in the case of little Ray, who, even though he was healthy, announced that he was in contact with his baby brother and that he would be dying soon, and then Ray did die. We also saw something similar in the case of Daisy Dryden, who was able to predict the exact time of her death, 11:30 p.m., several hours in advance. However, these two instances don't provide us with particularly strong evidence of something paranormal happening. In both cases, you could appeal to some kind of subjective, internal, physical feeling that the children had. I mean, maybe little Ray could feel that he was sick, even though his mother didn't perceive it. And maybe Daisy could feel how quickly her body was failing and make an estimate of when she would die. Also, in both cases, you could appeal to the power of suggestion. After Ray saw his baby brother had died, he could have become fixated on the idea that he would die too. And his mother said that Ray was constantly telling her about the baby calling him. So maybe Ray died because the power of suggestion that he would die. Similarly, maybe the power of suggestion played a role in Daisy's death. Perhaps she predicted that she would die at 11:30, and then she subconsciously willed this to happen, or even consciously willed it so that she could go to the beautiful world she was seeing. So even though the predictive material in these cases has some value, it can be explained in natural terms, and we'd want better cases of paranormal information than this. However, Sir Barrett doesn't have a lot of strongly predictive cases in his collection, though they may exist elsewhere in the literature.
What about other kinds of paranormal information besides predictions? Are there other types of deathbed visions where that comes out?
Sure. It doesn't have to be information of a predictive nature. It also could be information about something, about what someone is thinking, that is telepathic information, or it could be information about a distant location or clairvoyant information. In fact, there's a whole chapter in Sir Barrett's book about clairvoyant cases, but they're tied up with another evidential phenomenon I want to talk about, so we'll save those for later in this episode. I think a particularly strong type of evidential phenomenon occurs in the Akin and Darien experiences that I mentioned earlier, where a dying person sees someone that they didn't know to be dead. For example, like when Daisy apparently discovered the existence of the two deceased children of Mrs. H, which she supposedly didn't even know about. However, the details on this case are sparse enough that it's not the strongest, since it's possible, since the children had died years earlier, that at some point in her childhood, Daisy had heard about Mrs. H's children and nobody remembered this. It would be stronger if the death had only just occurred and people had deliberately avoided telling her about it. So let's look at a case of that nature. This one comes from Lady Barrett, who you will remember was a physician. Sir Barrett reports,
a recent case of the kind was related to me by Lady Barrett, which occurred when she was in attendance on a patient in the Mothers' Hospital at Clapton, of which she is one of the obstetric surgeons. Lady Barrett received an urgent message from the resident medical officer, Dr. Phillips, to come to a patient, Mrs. B., who was in labor and suffering from serious heart failure. Lady Barrett went at once, and the child was delivered safely, though the mother was dying at the time. After seeing other patients, Lady Barrett went back to Mrs. B's ward, and the following conversation occurred, which was written down soon afterwards. Lady Barrett says,
When I entered the ward, Mrs. B held out her hands to me and said, "Thank you. Thank you for what you have done for me, for bringing the baby. Is it a boy or a girl?" Then, holding my hand tightly, she said, "Don't leave me. Don't go away, will you?" And after a few minutes, while the house surgeon carried out some restorative measures, she lay looking up towards the open part of the room, which was brightly lighted, and said, "Oh, don't let it get dark. It's getting so dark, darker and darker." Her husband and mother were sent for. Suddenly, she looked eagerly towards one part of the room, a radiant smile illuminating her whole countenance. "Oh, lovely, lovely," she said. I asked, "What is lovely?" "What I see," she replied in low, intense tones. "What do you see?" "Lovely brightness, wonderful beings." It is difficult to describe the sense of reality conveyed by her intense absorption in the vision. Then, seeming to focus her attention more intently on one place for a moment, she exclaimed, almost with a kind of joyous cry, "Oh, it's Father. Oh, he's so glad I'm coming. He is so glad. It would be perfect if only W, her husband, could come too." Her baby was brought for her to see. She looked at it with interest and then said, "Do you think I ought to stay for baby's sake?" Then, turning towards the vision again, she said, I can't stay. If you could see what I do, you would know I can't stay." But she turned to her husband, who had come in, and said, "You won't let baby go to anyone who won't love him, will you?" Then she gently pushed him to one side, saying, "Let me see the lovely brightness." I left shortly after, and the matron took my place by the bedside. She lived for another hour, and appeared to have retained to the last the double consciousness of the bright forms she saw, and also of those tending at her bedside. She arranged with the matron that her premature baby should remain in the hospital till it was strong enough to be cared for in an ordinary household. Signed, Florence E. Barrett.
Now, this is interesting, but we haven't yet gotten to the Akin and Darien part. That comes to the forefront in a statement by the matron of the hospital. She said,
I was present shortly before the death of Mrs. B., together with her husband and her mother. Her husband was leaning over her and speaking to her, when, pushing him aside, she said, "Oh, don't hide it. It is so beautiful." Then, turning away from him towards me, I being on the other side of the bed, Mrs. B. said, "Oh, why, there's Vita," referring to a sister, of whose death, 3 weeks previously, she had not been told. Afterwards, the mother, who was present at the time, told me, as I have said, that Vita was the name of a dead sister of Mrs. B.'s, of whose illness and death she was quite ignorant, as they had carefully kept this news from Mrs. B., owing to her serious illness. Signed, Miriam Castle, matron.
So Sir Barrett sought to get confirmation from Mrs. B.'s mother, and he did. Here's what her mother had to say.
I have heard you are interested in the beautiful passing of my dear daughter's spirit from this earth on the 12th day of January, 1924. The wonderful part of it is the history of the death of my dear daughter, Vida, who had been an invalid some years. Her death took place on the 25th day of December, 1923, just 2 weeks and 4 days before her younger sister Doris died. My daughter Doris, Mrs. B., was very ill at the time, and the matron at the Mother's Hospital deemed it unwise for Mrs. B. to know of her sister's death. Therefore, when visiting her, we put off our mourning and visited her as usual. All her letters were also kept by request until her husband had seen who they might be from before letting her see them. This precaution was taken lest outside friends might possibly allude to the recent bereavement in writing to her, unaware of the very dangerous state of her health. When my daughter was sinking rapidly, at first she said, "It is all so dark, I cannot see." A few seconds after, a beautiful radiance lit up her countenance. I know now it was the light of heaven, and it was most beautiful to behold. My dear child said, "Oh, it is lovely and bright. You cannot see as I can." She fixed her eyes on one particular spot in the ward, saying, "Oh God, forgive me for anything I have done wrong." After that, she said, "I can see Father. He wants me. He is so lonely." She spoke to her father, saying, "I am coming," turning at the same time to look at me, saying, "Oh, he is so near." On looking at the same place again, she said with a rather puzzled expression, "He has Vida with him," turning again to me, saying, "Vida is with him." Then she said, "You do want me, Dad. I am coming." Then a very few parting words or sighs were expressed, nothing very definite or clear. With great difficulty and a very hard strain, she asked to see the man who had married us. This was to her husband, who was standing on the opposite side of the bed. The name of the man who married them she could not say. It was the Reverend Maurice Davis, of All Saints, Haggerston, England. He was sent for. He had known my dear child for some years, and was so impressed by the vision that he had it quoted in his parish magazine for February last. Yours respectfully, Mary C. Clark.
I think that Mrs. B's perception that her father was lonely in the afterlife is likely an example of misperception. I think that she likely correctly perceived that he wanted her to come be with him and Vida in the afterlife, and she then misinterpreted that as loneliness. However, the really significant thing that makes this a Akin and Darien experience is that she saw Vida. Vida had only died 2 weeks and 4 days before Mrs. B, and that's not a lot of time for the information to get to her by normal means. Further, the matron of the hospital, Miriam Castle, had recommended against letting her know about Vida's death because of her frail health and heart condition. Seeing that Mrs. B was already in the hospital with a difficult pregnancy and with heart disease that was so advanced it would kill her after the baby was delivered. Consequently, the family made a point of not telling Mrs. B about Vida's death, and they even screened her mail to make sure that nobody who was writing to her let it slip. The evidence thus strongly suggests that Mrs. B did not know about Vida's death through any normal means, which is confirmed by the fact that she was puzzled when she saw Vida with her father in the DBV. In any case, it looks like she got the information about Vida's death from the DBV, and thus that something genuinely paranormal was happening here.
Could she have learned the information in a paranormal way that wouldn't imply the survival of the human soul?
Hypothetically, yes, since the matron, the mother, and the husband all knew about Vida's death. You could propose that Mrs. B just picked it up from them telepathically. However, I have two problems with this. First, I believe in what in philosophy is called phenomenal conservatism, which means taking an experience as it appears until we have reason to take it in some other sense. We use this principle all the time. It's the only way to get through life without being paranoid. And in this experience, it appears that Mrs. B got the information that Vida was dead from the DBV. We have no evidence of her picking it up telepathically from one of the other people around her.
What's the second reason you have a problem with the telepathy proposal?
It's the fact that the telepathy explanation doesn't explain other peak and Darien experiences as well as it could here. You'll remember the one that Frances Cobb described, where a dying woman saw 3 of her deceased brothers in the afterlife, and then she saw a 4th brother who everyone present thought was just fine and alive in India. In fact, you'll recall the news was so shocking that one of the women present couldn't handle it and rushed out of the room. And then later, they got letters informing them that the 4th brother had died in India. So nobody present knew about the 4th brother's death. And so the dying woman could not have telepathically picked up the information from anyone around her. It is hypothetically possible that she had reached across the world and picked up the information about the brother's death telepathically from him at the time it happened, and then she would have had to store the information subconsciously, and it only bubbled up into her conscious mind during the DBV. But this is a needlessly complex explanation that doesn't fit the observations, and Occam's razor warns us against needlessly complex explanations. So the logical explanation is that she got the information about the 4th brother's death the way it appeared to happen, by seeing him in the afterlife in the deathbed vision. Sir Barrett covers additional peak and Darien experiences in his book, some of which are quite impressive, but these will serve for our purposes.
You said that there was a second type of deathbed vision, besides the ones that have paranormal information, that also provide additional evidence. What do those involve?
Basically, they involve other people besides the dying person perceiving some aspect of the experience. A similar class of experiences were discovered after NDE research began. When Raymond Moody first published on near-death experiences in the 1970s, he was only aware of accounts that were reported by people who had died or almost died and then came back to describe what happened. But later, he discovered that sometimes people who weren't dying would also perceive aspects of what was happening with the dying person. In other words, as the person is having their NDE, one or more people around them also perceives something of what the dying person is experiencing. Like they may see the dying person leaving their body, or they may feel like they're being pulled out of their bodies too, or like they're also going through a dark tunnel with their dying loved one. Today, these are referred to as shared NDEs because they are shared by people who are still living and not in danger of death. Well, the same thing is true of deathbed visions. In his book, Sir Barrett reports multiple cases where those around the dying person also saw or heard something paranormal. In other words, shared deathbed visions. Since this episode's getting long, we won't go through many of such cases, but here's a simple one that Sir Barrett reports.
In one case, 2 women watching by their dying sister, Charlotte, saw a bright light, and within it 2 young faces hovering over the bed, gazing intently at Charlotte. The elder sister recognized these faces as being 2 of her brothers, William and John, who had died when she was young. The 2 sisters continued to watch the faces till they gradually faded away like a washed-out picture, and shortly afterwards, their sister Charlotte died.
So in this case, 2 women, so we have 2 independent witnesses, saw a manifestation of the deceased brothers' faces as they were watching over their dying sister. Here's another experience reported by Professor W.C. Crosby.
Mrs. Carolyn Rogers, 72 years old, a widow who had been twice married, and whose first husband, a Mr. Tisdale, died about 35 years ago, has lived on Ashland Street in Roslindale, Massachusetts for the last 25 years, and since the death of her last child some years ago, she's lived quite alone. Early in March of this year, she was stricken with paralysis, and after an illness of nearly 6 weeks, died on the afternoon of Tuesday, April 15th. Mrs. Mary Wilson, a professional nurse, 45 years old, attended Mrs. Rogers during her illness, remaining with her almost constantly until she died. She had never seen Mrs. Rogers before the latter's illness and knew nothing of her family or history. Mrs. Rogers spoke frequently to Mrs. Wilson and also to others, as had long been her custom, of her second husband, Mr. Rogers, and children, expressing a desire to see them again, etc. On the afternoon of April 14th, Mrs. Rogers became unconscious and remained so all the time until her death 24 hours later. Mrs. Wilson sat up with her through the whole of Monday night. Mrs. Wilson's daughter, Ida, 25 years old, kept her mother company, and a boy of 10 or 12 years slept in an adjoining chamber to be called in case of an emergency. These four were the only persons in the house. The outer doors were securely locked. Mrs. Wilson rested on a settee placed at right angles to the head of Mrs. R's bed, so that when lying down, her face was almost directly opposite this door and not more than 10 or 12 feet from it. The lamp, which burned brightly all night, stood on a small table in the corner of the room directly opposite the door, and Ida occupied a couch against the wall and between the lamp and the door. Mrs. Wilson was pretty well worn out with her long vigil. Believing that Mrs. Rogers was dying, she was naturally very nervous and timid, and having heard Mrs. R. speak frequently of seeing her departed friends, etc., she had a feeling of expectancy and dread with regard to supernatural visitations. Between 2 and 3 a.m., while her daughter was asleep, and while she was resting on the settee but wide awake, she happened to look toward the door into the adjoining chamber and saw a man standing exactly in the doorway, the door being kept open all the time. He was middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with shoulders thrown back, had a florid complexion, reddish-brown hair and beard, and wore a brown sack overcoat which was unbuttoned. His expression was grave, neither stern nor pleasant, and he seemed to look straight at Mrs. Wilson, and then at Mrs. Rogers without moving. Mrs. Wilson supposed, of course, that it was a real man, and tried to think how he could have got into the house. Then, as he remained quite motionless, she began to realize that it was something uncanny, and becoming frightened, turned her head away and called her daughter, who was still asleep on the couch, awakening her. On looking back at the door, after an interval of a minute or two, the apparition had disappeared. Both its coming and going were noiseless, and Mrs. Rogers remained perfectly quiet, and so far as could be known, entirely unconscious during this time. The chamber into which this door leads being quite dark, there was no opportunity to observe whether or not the apparition was transparent. Mrs. Wilson, shortly afterwards, went into this chamber and the living room, but did not examine the lower part of the house until morning, when the doors were found properly locked and everything all right. In the morning, Mrs. Rogers' niece, Mrs. Hildreth, who lives in the neighborhood and has known Mrs. R. and her family for many years, called at the house. Mrs. Wilson related her experience to her and asked if the apparition resembled Mr. Rogers, and Mrs. Hildreth replied emphatically that it did not. All who knew Mr. Rogers are agreed on this point. Their conversation was interrupted then, but when resumed later in the day, Mrs. Hildreth said that Mrs. Wilson's description agreed exactly with Mr. Tisdale, Mrs. Rogers' first husband. Mrs. Rogers came to Rosendale after marrying Mr. Rogers, and Mrs. Hildreth is the only person in that vicinity who ever saw Mr. Tisdale. And in Mrs. Rogers' house there is no portrait of him, nor anything suggestive of his personal appearance. Mrs. Wilson is also very positive that the apparition was unlike anyone she ever knew.
So, as Mrs. Rogers was dying, the nurse, Mrs. Wilson, saw the apparition of a man with red hair and a beard. It wasn't me. Which is exactly what Mrs. Rogers' first husband, Mr. Tisdale, had looked like. Even though there was no picture of him in the house and only one person in the area had ever seen him. And here is a third and final case where a dying woman apparently used what is called traveling clairvoyance to visit her children before she died. And she was seen at the location where her children were, which makes this a case of bilocation. We talked about bilocation in episode 212, so you can go to mysterious.fm/212 to learn about bilocation. Now, this case is from the year 1691, and it was reported by a clergyman named Reverend Thomas Tilson.
Mary, the wife of John Goff of Rochester, being afflicted with a long illness, removed to her father's house at West Mulling, which was about 9 miles distant from her own. There she died, June 4th, 1691. The day before her departure, she grew impatiently desirous to see her 2 children, whom she had left at home to the care of a nurse. She prayed her husband to hire a horse, for she must go home to die with her children. Between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, she fell into a trance. One widow Turner, who watched with her that night, says that her eyes were open and fixed, and her jaw fallen. She put her hand on her mouth and nostrils, but could perceive no breath. She thought her to be in a fit, and doubted whether she was alive or dead. The next day, this dying woman told her mother that she had been at home with her children. "That is impossible," said the mother, "for you have been here in bed all the while." "Yes," replied the other, "but I was with them last night while I was asleep." The nurse at Rochester, Widow Alexander by name, affirms and says she will take her oath of it before a magistrate, and receive the sacrament upon it, that a little before 2 o'clock that morning she saw the likeness of the said Mary Goff come out of the next chamber, where the elder child lay in a bed by itself, the door being open, and stood by her bedside for about a quarter of an hour. The younger child was there lying by her. Her eyes moved and her mouth went, but she said nothing. The nurse, moreover, says that she was perfectly awake. It was then daylight, being one of the longest days in the year. She sat up in her bed and looked steadfastly upon the apparition. At that time she heard the bridge clock strike 2, and a while after said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what art thou?" Thereupon the appearance removed and went away. She slipped on her clothes and followed, but what became of it she cannot tell. Then, and not before, she began to be grievously affrighted, and went out of doors and walked upon the wharf, the house is just by the riverside, for some hours, only going in now and then to look at the children. At 5 o'clock she went to a neighbor's and knocked at the door, but they would not rise. At 6 she went again, then they rose and let her in. She related to them all that had passed. They would persuade her she was mistaken or dreamt, but she confidently affirmed, "If ever I saw her in all my life, I saw her this night." The writer then gives an account of how one of those to whom she related the story confirmed the above narrative. The substance of this statement was related to me by John Carpenter, the father of the deceased, the next day after the burial, July 2nd. I fully discoursed the matter with the nurse and 2 neighbors to whose house she went that morning. 2 days after, I had it from the mother, the minister that was with her in the evening, and the woman who sat up with her last that night. They all agree in the same story, and everyone helps to strengthen the other's testimony. They all appear to be sober, intelligent persons, far enough off from designing to impose a cheat upon the world, or to manage a lie, and what temptation they should lie under for so doing I cannot conceive. Thomas Tilson.
This is just one of many experiences of this kind where a dying person seems to clairvoyantly visit distant living people, such as family members, in a deathbed vision, in this case, one occurring while she slept. And the dying person is perceived at the site by independent witnesses. So deathbed visions are an interesting phenomenon, and we will be discussing them and the research that has been done on them in the future.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
Well, as listeners know, I've lost many people in my life. I lost all 4 of my grandparents, I lost both of my parents, and I lost my wife, Renee. The thought of being greeted by them when I approach my own final hour and having them welcome me into the afterlife is an appealing one, and I hope it happens. So I thought I'd close by giving the final word to Frances Cobb, who wrote the following in her essay.
For most of us, God be thanked, no dream of celestial glory has half the ecstasy of the thought that in dying we may meet, and meet at once, before we have had a moment to feel the awful loneliness of death. The parent, wife, husband, child, friend of our life, soul of our soul, whom we consigned long ago with breaking hearts to the grave. Their beautiful forms, as that dying lady beheld her brother and sister, entering our chamber, standing beside our bed of death, and come to rejoin us forever. What words can describe the happiness of such a vision? It may be awaiting us all. There is even, perhaps, a certain probability that it is actually the natural destiny of the human soul, and that the affections, which alone of earthly things can survive dissolution, will, like magnets, draw the beloved and loving spirits of the dead around the dying. I can see no reason why we should not indulge so ineffably blessed a hope. But even if it be a dream, the faith remains, built on no such evanescent and shadowy foundation, that there is one friend, and he the best, in whose arms we shall surely fall asleep, and to whose love we may trust for the reunion, sooner or later, of the severed links of sacred human affection.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line?
Deathbed visions are a fascinating experience that appears all through history and in all cultures. In the last century, it has become the object of scientific study, and both Frances Cobbe's essay and Sir William Barrett's book contributed to the beginning of that study. Already, we have seen many of the different aspects of deathbed visions that they may take on, and some provide evidence that they are more than just the subjective hallucinations of the dying, particularly when they contain paranormal knowledge that turns out to be true, most strikingly in the case of Akin and Darien experiences, where the dying person perceives someone in the afterlife they didn't know had died. And also in cases where the experience or aspects of it is shared by independent living witnesses. We'll have more to say about deathbed visions and the research on them in the future, but this is an initial look at the subject, and it can raise in all of us hope that when our time comes, and whether anyone else perceives it or not, we will be welcomed into the afterlife by our departed loved ones.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer?
We'll have a link to Sir William Barrett's book, Deathbed Visions, also Frances Power Cobbe's essay, Akin and Darien, The Riddle of Death, a link to the Society for Psychical Research, information about Sir William Barrett from the Reliable Psi Encyclopedia, and information about him from the much less reliable Wikipedia. Also information about Frances Power Cobbe, John Keats' poem, also information about the Darien Gap in Panama, and the hymn, O Come Angel Band by YouTuber Heather Berry Maybe.
And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about deathbed visions and the research that was done on them by Frances Cobbe and Sir William Barrett? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special thanks to Anna Fontaine for providing the female voice work for this episode. Also, thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on the episode. Do check out the video version of the podcast. You'll be surprised at how much the video adds. You can do that by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, I am trying to grow my channel, so you can help me with that by liking, commenting, and subscribing. And when you subscribe, be sure to hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video. Usually these days I have multiple videos per week.
Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be starting an occasional series on what you might call lost scriptures. These are books that aren't in the Bible, but they were at one time considered scripture by at least some individuals. Then they became lost to popular consciousness, only to be rediscovered by scholars in more recent times. So we're going to be looking at them and seeing what light they may shed on things in the Bible and the early church. We'll begin our series by looking at one of the most popular lost scriptures, the book of Jubilees. Jubilees was very popular around the time of Jesus, and it was regarded as scripture by the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's also some evidence that it, or at least the ideas contained in it, may have influenced some of the authors of the New Testament. Jubilees is basically a rewritten version of Genesis and part of Exodus, so it interacts with the Bible in some interesting ways. And if you want, you might want to refresh your memories of Genesis and Exodus to see how it compares and contrasts.
Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or review it wherever you can get your podcasts. That helps us grow our community and reach more listeners. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt or mug or more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/318. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. Customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.